Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the July edition of the Trusted Tech webinar. My name is Lance, and we're going to be joining you in just a few moments with some other folks and faces. But I wanted to give us just a couple of minutes to get settled in and some of our stragglers to fill in. Today, we're going to be talking about Azure capacity, resiliency planning, and what the future looks like for clients that are lit up in Azure or are planning on expanding their footprint in Azure. Just a couple little housekeeping things before we get started, and we'll call this out again in a little bit. If you do have trouble with any of the slides during the presentation today, little trick. In Teams, you can click on View and then More Options, and then click Add Shared Display. And that tends to fix whatever's ailing the display as we're going through our chat today. So we're going to give folks just a couple more minutes to get in before we get started. For the folks that are here, where's everybody coming to us from today? I am from the hot and sweltery central Illinois area, Peoria, Illinois. And it is warm here. So call out where you're from. Hopefully we got folks joining us from all over the globe today. And again, we'll get started in just a couple minutes here. We're just going to give folks another minute or two to file in. It is great to have everybody joining us today. Hopefully we've got some good information coming your way. And we'll call things out in just another minute or two here once folks are in the lobby. See some folks coming from Norway. Welcome. I guess good afternoon. It's morning for us over here. And Jordan, a couple of Georgia folks here. It's good to see that great state represented. All right, well, one more minute here. We'll give folks just another second to get piled in. We typically ask warm-up questions to get the group going here, and I think a very appropriate one for today. Speaking of warm, in the US here, and I think in Europe recently as well, we've been dealing with quite the heat wave. What's the record temperature you hit in your area in the last couple weeks here? I might have a winner because my wife was just out in Las Vegas to see the Backstreet Boys. Obviously, that was a girls' trip. I did not participate, which I kind of regret after seeing some of the pictures. It looked like it was pretty cool. But they hit 120 degrees Fahrenheit out there a couple days ago. So she definitely got her money's worth when it comes to the heat. All right, well, I think we've given folks a little bit of time to get settled in here, so we're going to go ahead and get rolling. Like I said earlier, if you missed it, my name is Lance Wade-Zunis. I'm the manager for Azure Services and Solutions here at Trusted Tech. Today, we're going to be talking about Azure capacity and resiliency and how to kind of assess your environment, prepare it for the future, as well as some of the things that we've found in our experiences over the last few months as Azure capacity has kind of dwindled and Microsoft doesn't seem to be adding a whole lot of additional hardware. But the demand continues to go up. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. I am joined by our senior cloud architect from the Azure ProServe team, Jordan Gladden, and Andrew Ramos, who's one of our really talented account managers. So can you guys take a moment just to introduce yourselves and then we'll get going?
All right, I'll hop out first. Jordan Gladden, like Lance said, senior cloud architect here. Prior to this job, I worked in the DoD for 20 years, specifically in the Army. I was, I did 20 years in the Army and then moved out in the civilian sector. So last couple of years in the Army is where I got my cloud experience, but, a lot of experience in the IT world.
Well, thank you for your service, Jordan.
Thank you, Lance.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Andrew Ramos here, dedicated account manager at Trusted Tech. I've been a member of the team for the better part of 3 years now, helping clients optimize both M365 and Azure environments. And I'll tell you what, I've worked at length with Lance and Jordan, and they are rock stars. I'm really looking forward to the conversation today, Lance, just because it's coming up more and more. So now more than ever, I think our clients need to hear it. So looking forward to it.
Hey, you sound a little bit like a commercial from COVID there, Andrew. Now more than ever in these trying times, but it is relevant because this is stuff that our clients are dealing with day in and day out. So let's talk a little bit about what the plan is for today. We've got a little under an hour here. We're gonna try and be cognizant of everyone's time. And so what I will say is we're going to have a Q&A session towards the end. You folks can go ahead and pop questions into the Q&A for our chat here. If anything comes up along the way, we will definitely circle back and get to those once we wrap things up. But we're going to start off by talking a little bit about the risks, the hidden risks in Azure. And this is something that a lot of folks don't even realize exists until you really start getting deep into the ecosystem. And then these, surprises kind of pop up along the way. Then we're going to pivot over to capacity planning, what it really is, how it works, and how we can help you kind of figure out what direction you need to go with that planning. I'm going to talk a little bit about backups because it's one of my favorite things other than printers. I'm kidding. I hate printers. But this is something that I think is really important. It is near and dear to my heart. And I think it's one of those things that needs to be discussed in more depth as we have our conversations with clients. After that, we're going to get into Fabric. And a lot of folks are moving over to Fabric for analytics. Capacity planning is a necessary evil when it comes to that as well. Even though it's a platform service, it's still something we need to think about as we start expanding our consumption of those resources. And then we're going to talk about how to build a resilient Azure strategy for this year and beyond. Microsoft is expanding their data centers, but unfortunately, clients are expanding their workloads a lot faster than Microsoft can keep up. So we're going to make sure that we have the tools and tactics in place to help manage that growth and control that sprawl. So with that said, let's get into our first topic of discussion here, the hidden risks in Azure. These are things a lot of organizations don't see. And I wanted to throw a polling question out there before we really get into the weeds here and just ask, have you ever had to submit a quota request? This is something that a lot of clients hopefully never have to do. But it is one of those things that, we are seeing a lot more frequently. And I know Andrew will definitely speak to that when he gets some more time to discuss what he sees in his day-to-day as an account manager. But that being said, I want to throw it over to Jordan as our senior cloud architect. He deals with kind of the high and low level day-to-day of dealing with Microsoft capacity and resiliency. So Jordan, go ahead, tell us a little bit about how Microsoft provides tools for us to create a resilient environment in Azure.
Okay, thanks. Good morning, everyone. Seeing the poll results come in, I'm actually a little bit surprised. I would think that these numbers would be a little bit higher. But, if you haven't put in a quota request, you might in the future. It looks like we're at about 69 and 30%, 69 being no and 30% being yes. We'll talk about some of those workloads, that are going to require quota requests moving forward. But we've all seen, I think most of us has seen the well-architected framework. It's something, I used to be an MCT as well. It's something we used to teach. I'm pretty sure everybody's familiar with these pillars. So I'll just kind of hop into exactly what we're going to be talking about today, which is, our reliability pillar. When we start talking about DR, when we start talking about capacity planning, there's a couple things we need to keep in mind, like with the Microsoft definition, right? So it's not necessarily just availability, right? Availability is in there, but it's a third of the picture. The rest is resilient, recoverable, and available. And another thing that I'd like to keep in mind here is when we start talking about the way we measure our outcomes, it's not necessarily just do I have a probe going to a web application? That web application is alive. Is it truly alive? Is it meeting the business outcome? And that's another thing we need to try to think about reframing the way we think about reliability. I know I mentioned, 20 years in DoD myself. It's one of the things we used to put on all of our evaluations, provided X amount of reliability during X amount of exercises, 96% uptime. But were we really providing the function that the warfighter needed in that moment, or the function that the business needed in that moment? And that's the question that we should be asking ourselves as we architect these solutions. It's not about, is the slide green? Are we meeting the business intent with our disaster recovery solution? So that's a meaningful higher bar than just, is it available, right? Is it meeting our business end state? Are we able to fail over and the business be fluid throughout that failover? So we're not departing from Microsoft's guidance here. We're just kind of actually grounding it in what they're saying. And that's another thing that they're saying is, hey, reliability is not availability. Reliability means more than that. It means that the business can survive when we do this failover. So I think that's about that on that slide. If we could go to the next slide, please. And this one, It's one of those things, right? So, like I mentioned, I used to be an MCT, and I had especially on the AZ900 slide decks. You had a lot. It was almost like an advertisement, right? And that's one of the things that Microsoft pitched. The great thing about the cloud is it's almost infinite, right? You can scale on demand,
Almost. Yeah.
almost infinite. Well, I honestly, actually, they've made it seem like it was infinite in those slides. And that was several years ago, and we've seen things change since then. But, that was one of the things that we got pitched when we moved to the cloud is, hey, I'll have capacity on demand whenever I need it. And that's not necessarily the case anymore. The cloud is no longer infinite. If it ever was infinite, well, it's never really truly infinite, but to the point that, you weren't going to run into any problems. Whereas now we are seeing people that are coming across problems that they try to expand in the cloud, right? So that's the reality. Capacity is finite and increasing on demand. And it doesn't necessarily mean that Azure is getting worse. It just means that it's getting popular in very specific spaces. And as everybody on this call grows in that space, we're competing against one another for that finite capacity, right? So probably not a conversation we would have had 5 to even 7 years ago. Probably wouldn't have been something that we would have been talking about too much, because when you made a quota request 5 to 7 years ago, it was just automatically approved. But that's not what we're seeing anymore. So as we start talking about our DR, how we're going to fail over, whether it be from failing over into on-prem into Azure, or whether that be failing over from region to region, we need to not assume that capacity is going to be there. So when we start talking about successful cloud strategies, we don't assume it's going to be there. We plan around it, right? So we plan around our capacity requirements, our constraints, and we make sure that we've got a resilient solution that when we fail over, when we press the button, when we do the thing, whatever we need for that business outcome is available for us on the other side. The other thing, limited availability of specific VM filings or GPU resources. So I kind of like prepped a little bit when we talked about quotas. If you haven't ever deployed a GPU type resource in Azure, it used to be that you would get like a couple cores just as a, kind of like a teaser or preview. But now what we're seeing across the board in almost every region, or in every region now, if you want anything that's a GPU resource, you have to do a quota request. So for the node,
Jordan, it's almost like there's a GPU driven technology that's emerged in the last couple of years that has chewed up all of those resources.
It's almost like there's this thing called, AI that's kind of,
Mm-hmm.
chewing all that up, right? And so
Yep.
we see different clients using this in different ways. We got some people who do some imagery stuff. We've got some people that do financial analysis. Actually, financial analysis in this particular company is probably what we see the most. But you'll see people who are provisioning users with, these VM SKUs that are kind of astronomical, but it is because these people are just getting in there and doing this type of work in the financial space and the imagery space. They need a lot of compute in order to get what they need. So in that vein, or in that line of thinking, if we're going to make a move into a different region, if we're going to make a move from on-prem into Azure, we need to have this as part of our plan. We need to start thinking like, okay, we're not going to assume that I can move into East US and deploy 200 of these AVD desktops that are GPU driven. Like that may or may not be able to happen, because you're competing with Fortune 500 companies with that deployment. It's a very contested region, et cetera, et cetera. So unfortunately, the cloud isn't infinite anymore, or it was never really infinite, but for our purposes, right, it's something that we need to plan around. And especially when we start talking about preferred regions, I just mentioned East US, same thing with AWS, like the older
Yep.
regions, the ones that are the most contested. I think that's enough for this slide. If we can move to the next one, please. And then 5 Azure capacity myths. So I think, Lance, you were going to talk about one or two of these, or I can take
Yeah,
them all.
some of these are pretty good, and this is stuff. I mean, these are things that we've sourced from conversations with clients in the last couple months here. So this isn't something that we just kind of guessed or made up or asked our friend Claude to create for us. These came straight from conversations with clients, and I know Andrew's probably heard a few of these as well. But like Jordan was just saying, the cloud is unlimited. That is not true. Maybe in February or January of 2020, that might have been closer to true. But the world changed a little bit shortly thereafter. We don't need to get into the how or the why. I think we all know. But suddenly there was a massive exodus from on-prem into the cloud, whether it was AWS, GCP, or Azure. Folks needed to move resources to be elastic and available. And suddenly we saw the in fill up rapidly, and there was a no vacancy sign posted shortly thereafter. Microsoft, Amazon, Google, all of these companies, Oracle responded as quickly as they could. And then we ran into a supply chain issue shortly thereafter, if you remember. So that kind of slowed the expansion of these enterprise data centers. We're recovering from that, but we still see the cost of hardware and the availability of hardware like memory, GPUs, all of that stuff is still being affected. But clients are still wanting to adopt cloud technologies at the same rate. Although we are seeing some companies start to scale back a little bit. And part of that is because they're running into these capacity issues. But that's kind of where TrustedTech comes in. We can kind of help figure out the strategy here. Just because you need an NVV3 GPU in Azure and it's not available doesn't mean that's your only option. There are ways to pivot and ways to mitigate these things. Jordan, you want to take the next one?
Yeah, so if it deployed once, it will deploy again. So anybody who's ever done an IAC deployment, I've seen this before. You do a test, everything looks, you do a what if, everything looks fine. What if doesn't cover your capacity, right? So just because it deployed one other time doesn't mean it's going to work the next time. So, we've got to build that assumption into everything we're doing and build validation into our deployments. The other thing kind of that leads us into myth 3, that failover will automatically work. Once again, in a scenario where you go down, everybody else that is in that region who has DR peering is now failing over. If they might match the region that you're failing over to, right? So that's something that we have to keep in mind and kind of build into the plan. Okay, if SKU X isn't available, we're going to scale up, or most likely you're going to scale up. You're probably not going to scale down because you don't want to affect the business, right? We're going to scale up to X, the next SKU. And this is what that's going to mean. And this is when we're going to revisit it on the other side, depending on what the run book is for you and your team. And then the other thing, scaling is instantaneous. It is. Elasticity is a real thing in the cloud. Availability sets work, but the orchestrator has to have the underlying compute behind it in order to make that happen. So once again, elasticity is definitely a thing in the cloud. It's one of the beautiful things about the cloud. But just because we say, hey, I've built an elasticity into this particular workload, we still have to make sure that back-end orchestrator is able to call that workload out when the time happens.
And the last one there, Jordan, availability equals resiliency. I think we were talking about it last week of Schrodinger's resiliency or Schrodinger's backup. I think one of you guys was going to steal that from me, but I got it first. It's like if you plan all this stuff out, but then never ever test it, it doesn't exist. And your last backup, your last DR plan, your last failover test is only as good as the last time it successfully worked. So if you don't go to the next step of actually testing your plan, it's no good. It might as well just not exist at all. And so that's one of those things that's really important as we start planning for, where do we go? What do we need to do to actually address these issues? There's a couple of risks that we don't really always talk about up front. And I think Jordan's going to talk about some of the things that we've seen during various projects and whatnot that we've done over the last, couple of years here. Jordan, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, so I would like to see the product improve a little bit in Azure Migrate, and I've actually ran into this. So you'll have, whether it's a quota increase or just unavailability in a region for a particular SKU, when you do an Azure Migrate job, or if you're not familiar, you deploy an appliance, the appliance kind of sits at the virtualization layer, collects a bunch of data, matches a SKU in the region where we're targeting, and then at time of failover, you press the button, it does the thing, it migrates the VM. But I've actually seen several different times during a migration, the Azure Migrate appliance will target a SKU that's not available. And that's one of the things that that's a struggle here, right? The Azure doesn't really publicly announce the capacity availability, right? They keep that close to their vest because that's, internal data to them and something their competitor can use, et cetera, how they plan, the big customers that they're going after that they think that, hey, if they move into this data center, we can't have this other person taking that capacity, et cetera. So at migration time is not where we want to find out. And so that's why, when you do an Azure migrate job, one of the things that we suggest for customers, if we've got enough lead time, is to do that capacity reservation for the targeted SKUs, so that way it's available for us when the migration comes. Failover and disaster recovery, once again, if I'm in East US and I'm going to fail over to West US, is the compute available for me in West US when the time comes? Or more commonly, it would probably be East and Central, right? A lot of people are going to be failing over from East to Central or East to East US 2. So plan that accordingly, right? All right, what workloads do I need to meet my business, critical functions? And then maybe I start looking at, okay, it might be worth it for me in the business to spend a little bit of money here on a reservation, kind of split that workload behind something like Azure Front Door, and maybe have some stuff that's live in both regions. So that way, in the event that something happens, maybe we're spending up some back end resources, but our web front end is there for us. That's one way of thinking of that. Business growth, we've seen actually on a recent engagement, we were doing a migration, but also doing like an AVD proof of concept. And we ended up having to go to a different region because our quota, the quota request just didn't go through for everything. And once again, this is one of those GPU heavy workloads where we put in a request for 200 virtual CPUs, and just for whatever reason, we weren't able to meet that need. So we had to pivot and move to a different region, do the VNet peering, et cetera. And then obviously AI modernization is what's eating all this up. Azure Fabric, once again, the compute in these data centers, these are large data centers, especially when you start talking about region, you've got 3 different data centers on independent power cooling, et cetera. So that's another thing that kind of takes a little while to stand up, right? I think everywhere I know here, local to my area, data centers are standing up, but they're not the size of an Azure region. An Azure region, I forget, we looked at it, however many hundred or billions of dollars it was to stand one up. It's
$3.3 billion was the last reported number from Microsoft for a regional build out.
Yeah. So
billion with a B.
And so, we're seeing, I think it's East US 3 is standing up over here in Atlanta, Georgia. But once again, like the timeline keeps rolling as far as when that's going to come online, right? So all of these things mean that, once again, capacity is finite and we need to plan accordingly. I think that's about it on this slide if we want to move to the next one.
Yeah. So thank you, Jordan. That is really great insight. And it's always nice to have that, architectural level feedback from how projects are progressing and some of the things that we run into. And this is stuff that we deal with day in and day out. We do a lot of migrations, a lot of modernization projects. And so we've kind of created some, I guess we'll call it phase 0 steps that we like to take with clients on these projects to try and get out ahead of some of this stuff. And one of the things that we like to do is kind of create sort of a long-term roadmap. So we talk to clients about where you are today, where do you see these workloads in a year? And sometimes that's difficult to do, but we can usually help with the right questions and sort of the right input from an architectural standpoint. And so that actually brings up a great polling question we want to throw out there. Are you doing any long-term capacity or availability planning for your Azure workloads now? This is the time to really kind of get into figuring out what the next 12 months is going to look like on Azure. Like Jordan said, there is more capacity coming. It's being built. US East 3 has been kind of in the pipeline for 3 years now, but it keeps getting pushed back. It was 25, it was 26. Now it's hopefully first half of 2027, that data center will be online. And there's other facilities that Microsoft's kind of in the midst of getting ramped up as well. But right now, we kind of just got to play the hand that we're dealt. And working with a company like TrustedTech, we have some tips and tricks that we can help mitigate some of these things with. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we can help clients sort of assess what's in place and where those risks and concerns might be. But before we get there, I want to bring Andrew Ramos into the discussion. He's been very politely waiting by the wayside here. But Andrew, can you talk a little bit about some of the things that you get, the feedback you get from clients and the experiences and discussions that you've been having with your Azure clients around availability, resiliency, capacity?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and it's a perfect segue going from, the risks associated to not understanding quota capacity and, being more proactive and planning this stuff, right? Before we get into, some of the experience that I've been seeing on my side, just being a dedicated account manager, day in, day out, talking to clients, I think it's important to understand what you as the client, as the user of the Microsoft product can control, right? Versus what Microsoft controls. Because there are times where I see a disconnect when interacting with some of the organizations that we work here, right? The three big things that you control as an organization are the subscription quotas themselves. And of course, if all of those Azure resources are running through a CSP like TrustedTech, we will assist you in getting those quota capacity increases accepted. The resource requests, and then the most important is the actual deployment planning, right? You're meeting with your leadership. You're aware of what's coming in the second half of 2026, going into fiscal year 2027, right? It's important to understand what's coming down the horizon because that way we can work backwards and then start planning some of this stuff in advance. Now, what does Microsoft control? Lance, Jordan, to your guys' point, I mean, we have East US 3 coming out, God knows when. Sounds like it's going to be 2027. It's costing a lot of money. They control the physical infrastructure, right? Unfortunately, we have, we have no capabilities of doing that. They also control the regional service capacity itself, which is important when planning for disaster recovery, to Jordan's point in the last section. And overall, they control the capacity allocation across all of Azure, right? So if you are in a very heavy, maybe like East US or a very heavy region, it's important to know, okay, based off of the specific resource that I know I'm going to be expanding in the future, what can I reasonably reserve capacity for today, right? And that's really the big thing. And the thing I want you guys to take away from this meeting today is really the importance of planning when it comes to this stuff, right? I'll be honest, I'm sure you guys are aware, I'll do a quick little sidebar here. The Power BI Premium P1 license on the M365 side, that's gone. That's been deprecated. You have to move to Fabric F64. I guarantee you, if you go into Azure right now and you check your Fabric capacities for literally every single available region, you will have at most, and this is being generous, at most F16, right? We need to quadruple your quota just for you to get similar compute when it comes to F64. And that requires escalating a ticket to Microsoft. And sometimes, realistically, they're going to ask you for additional information. Hey, why do you need this quota capacity increased, right? And that can lead down a whole other can of worms. I don't want to put my clients in a scenario where they're waiting for Microsoft and chomping at the bit to set something up because, CFO or leadership is asking them to do something and we're kind of just sitting on our hands, right? Which is a perfect segue into, some of the things that Jordan was talking about in the previous slide as well. Some of the most common overlooked scenarios on the next slide here, right? First things first, cloud migrations, pretty standard. I know we discussed that. A big one that I feel like we haven't touched on too much in this discussion, scaling your existing applications. Hey, maybe you have a third-party application or you built a custom app within Azure that you're displaying to customers or clients. You need to expand capacity because of a new service offering or you're onboarding more clients. Growth initiatives can stall because of that, right? Because you don't have the capacity for the compute. DR is pretty standard in secondary regions, whether it's from east to central or central to west. That's definitely something that we should be proactively planning. And if there is no DR strategy in place, that's definitely a place that we should start, right? And that's something that, myself, Lance, and Jordan speak with clients about day in and day out here at TrustedTech. Obviously, the big buzzword, AI and analytics projects. I mean, we're helping clients stand up Fabric like hotcakes over here at TrustedTech. I genuinely think at least once a week, I'm having a call with my clients on migrating premium capacity workspaces from Power BI Premium into F64. That requires a capacity increase, right?
Hmm.
And then finally, business expansion, new environments. Maybe your organization has acquired a new business. You guys are going through the due diligence process of migrating that data and that infrastructure over. We want to make sure that we're prepared for that, right? And that kind of goes hand in hand with the cloud migration piece here. So all of that to say, right? And this kind of culminates in the final slide here is now we're aware of the risks, we're aware of the common scenarios that, a quota capacity increase can bite you in the rear. What do we do, right? You got to plan for it before you actually need it. Number one, assess your environment, know exactly what you run today in Azure, compute, storage, networking needs, reconfirm and validate that future growth. AI, Microsoft Fabric workloads, right? I know I spoke about it. AVD is another big one, to Jordan's point, utilizes a lot of GPU. And then from there, start building it into the cloud strategy, right? Whether that's, consulting with us here at TrustedTech, consulting with your internal team when it comes to validating those quotas early to ensure that when you're ready to do that failover or when you're ready to do that cloud migration, you're in lockstep, no issues. And honestly, it's probably a good idea to make it a monthly, a quarterly, maybe even a yearly thing to plan on it being a repeatable habit. But Lance, those are some of the big things that I see when speaking to clients day in and day out. This is becoming a more standard standard discussion that I'm having. So I'll pass it
Yeah.
back to you.
No, thanks, Andrew, and it's phenomenal insight. And there was somebody threw a question out in chat just a second ago about, is this a U.S. issue? No, this is a global issue. Microsoft data centers, both in U.S., in the EU, and APAC, they're all affected. They're all being consumed at similar rates, and growth is being planned and restricted. Kind of similarly across the globe. So although a lot of our references talk about US today, US East 2, and some issues there, this is not a US data center issue. This spans the globe. We've dealt with some stuff West Europe, very similar issues that we're dealing with in US East 2. Where AI expansion and consumption has just chewed up and earmarked all of the available resources. And something to think about, just because AI is really great with GPUs, it still needs CPU behind the scene as well. So all of those resources are also being consumed. That's why we see a lot of clients run into issues with, like, modern D series SKUs on Azure, where we can't get available capacity. And we'll talk about some of the things that we can do to mitigate that and work around it a little bit later. Before we get to that, I want to talk about one of my favorite things, which is disaster recovery, business continuity, and all the fun ways to make sure that you can sleep better at night. And just to throw another polling question out there, I want to ask, are you guys using DRBC features in Azure right now? And it's okay if you're not. A lot of companies have third-party solutions, Veeam, Datto, all these different cool toys that you've been using for years. But I just want to get a feel for, if you're using anything that Azure natively offers. And if not, don't worry about it. Just know that there's some other options out there. So let's talk a little bit about why backups are only as good as the last time you actually tested them. Just having backups out there doesn't mean that you are insulated or protected from disaster. We've seen this for years, where clients have this super efficient incremental backup strategy, terabytes and terabytes of images spanning years and years, and they've never actually done a DR drill. So all of this data that's sitting there, it is completely worthless until you actually try and stand up a recovery point from it. So many times it gets down to the point of, now there's an outage or a failure. Let's go ahead and restore off a backup that we've never tested. And we find out that it's actually been grabbing incremental copy that is corrupted or no good, or something else is wrong, and now we're basically back to square nothing why did we have the backup there in the first place? So really, the idea here is you can put the greatest systems in place. You can have the perfect DR runbook. Everything can be ready to go, but if you never test any of it, it does you absolutely no good. And so what we focus on is the readiness of recovery. We want to make sure that you are insulated regionally on the Azure side. So Technologies like Azure Site Recovery can help replicate your resources from one region to another, just having to pay for the storage on the other end. And you get instantaneous one-button failover. RTO is usually less than 5 or so minutes, depending on the workloads that you're replicating. You can test your failover with ASR anytime you want to. One button stands up resources in the other region, make sure they do exactly what you want to, and then one button stands them down. So that's something that we help clients build into those DR drills and those run books. And really, we want to just make sure that you're looking at the business holistically, the system from top to bottom. It's not just the domain controllers. It's not just the data. It's stuff like your identity and Entra. It's making sure that you have a plan in place when you want to actually fail over. Do your domain controllers stand up first? Do your SQL databases stand up second? Then do your web apps start? It's making sure that you go through and you architect this properly, can just make those incidents, if and when they do happen. Obviously, we want them to not happen. But when they do happen, you want to make sure that you have a planned and orchestrated response. And that's something that we help clients put together all the time, whether we're implementing Azure Site Recovery or just standing up a new Azure landing zone for a client. We're always thinking about what happens if all of this fails, and how can we better insulate our clients and their technologies and workloads from those sort of outages. But beyond that, a lot of folks assume things when it comes to disaster recovery and business continuity. And on our next slide, I've got some of the things out there that kind of we've heard or we've seen from clients. So one of them is Azure automatically handles DR. And that's sort of true when it comes to like a hardware failover in a, if you have LRS storage or even ZRS, where, there's an outage in one of the physical data centers. Yes, your data is replicated and it will fail over behind the scenes. But if there is a regional outage in Azure, for instance, something really goes wrong and East US 2 disappears off the map, just because you have, resources replicated to another region doesn't mean things are going to automatically start up. So you need to factor that into your plan. And then we hear folks talk about our backup strategy as a recovery strategy. Backups are great for doing a point-in-time restoration, but it doesn't mean that your backup is going to automatically provide full disaster recovery of everything that you're doing. So you need to really do dependency analysis. And that's one of the things that we call out on the other column there. Recovery plans break because of dependencies. This is something where you may not realize that you've got a feeder app into one of your SQL databases that's doing something behind the scenes, that's living on some random server that disappeared when somebody left the company 4 years ago and all that institutional knowledge left with them. But you sure find out when you need to fail over, because that's the one thing that prevents that whole system from actually starting up properly. So another thing we hear is secondary region will always have capacity. Jordan called this out earlier. So many times we build out replicated infrastructure with something like Azure Site Recovery, and then clients will not go through and do the needful of actually reserving that capacity. Because your plan is only as good as what you know for sure will start. But that's something that we can actually figure out with test failovers, where we, let's start it all up and see if it actually starts up. And then we talk about everything will fail over together. Unless you orchestrate it and plan it via your runbook, you're not going to have any automation behind the scenes. So sometimes, you may fail over your file server, but then your SQL servers aren't coming with it, and all kinds of things are going on behind the scenes, and you need to make sure that that plan is solid and that it's tested regularly. And then finally, we've tested recovery once. That's great. You can test it when it starts up the very first time you deploy it. That's a great thing to prove it does what it should. But what happens if, a month after you light up all of this DR infrastructure, something changes in one of those workloads, and then that's the change that triggers kind of that domino effect, where 6 months from now you have a complete outage or failure, and you go to roll back, but you only have 30 days of images. So what do you do there? That's why we test at least monthly. Rule of thumb is usually quarterly, but with something like Azure Site Recovery, where you have very quick and rapid stand up, stand down, you could do your DR drills pretty easily without having to call the whole team in on like a Saturday or something like that and have them sit there for 6 hours while things light up and then manually tear them down. So again, the things to take a look at when we're thinking about planning here, we want to check our dependencies. We want to make sure our identity is covered, whether that be Entra, ADDS, Okta, wherever it comes from. We want to make sure that's factored into the plan. Check your networking. If you're using third-party firewalls, please deploy one live in your secondary region. Those do not like to spin up from cold. You'll run into licensing issues and all kinds of other things. And this is something that I know Jordan is a big fan of. A lot of deployments that we do, that's not something that clients like to talk about. They want it all just sitting there cold, but some of these things need to be running in order to replicate and have high availability with their peers. Make sure you're planning for your capacity in your secondary region. Don't just assume it's going to turn on when you need it to. Look at your BAM, your bare ass minimum, as Jordan likes to talk about, and plan for that to start up. And then finally, make sure that you test any changes as these things evolve. This is a dynamic workload. Make sure that it's configured to start up with whatever changed last month. So that being said, Jordan, why don't you tell us a little bit about kind of what you've run into in projects? I called a couple of these things out, but I know you've got a lot more experience hands-on than I do.
Well, you mentioned a couple of good things there. I mean, going back to Schrodinger's failover, right? Like, can we fail over successfully? Has it actually happened, or is it on paper? And the other big one is, authentication. So, when we scope projects, that's one of the first things that we're looking at is what is the authentication model? Do we have any reliance of an on-prem? You know what I mean? You might have a situation where we're proxying something back. There's an application that lives on-prem that this application talks to that runs in the cloud. Well, okay, if we fail over, do we have the site-to-site connectivity in place? Are the appropriate portion protocols being allowed through, et cetera, et cetera? And that comes back into this next little step is, can the applications themselves communicate and authenticate? So Lance mentioned third-party firewalls, which, they're great. Fortinet does some great stuff. Palo Alto does some great stuff. But when you start talking about using them in the cloud, you start having to thinking about, okay, if I have a DR scenario, do I want to wait on a firewall deployment to happen, or you know what I mean? I'm just going to have two MVAs running at the same time in different regions, and that becomes a larger conversation of, okay, well, what workloads can I shift to the secondary region to make this work? At it, that those are all things you got to think about. Or maybe I move to an Azure native solution that I can deploy via IAC. And, rather than fight through that third-party firewall stuff that we would normally do as a part of a third-party MVA, maybe we move to something Azure native, because if we fail over, it's something we can deploy via IAC where everything else is lighting up. So these are all decisions that, you're going to have to, we would sit down with the business and talk about. We already talked about capacity in the region, where I think we've mentioned that enough to where everybody knows what that means. And then can we recover within our business defined RTOs and RPOs? Now, once again, this isn't an IT defined thing. This is the business thing. So, we're taking these RTOs and RPOs and making them palatable for executive staff, taking it back to them and saying, hey, look, if we spend X, then we can recover in Y amount of time. If we don't want to spend that money, this is what recovery looks like, from an RTO and RPO perspective, and then relay that risk back to the decision makers. They make the decision. And then when the event actually happens, we all have the data to go back to when we made this decision. We made this decision together from both an IT and business function perspective. We brought you these options. This is the option that was selected. Therefore, this is our RTO and RPO as we expected it, right? And we help with that communication as well as you get those back to those various stakeholders and decision makers. It's just very important that you get the data in front of them and relay it in terms of risk, in terms of dollars that they understand. So for example, hey, if we do not do this DR implementation, like as we're suggesting, it could take 8 hours for our website to be back online. At this point, we're just waiting on the region to come up. The last time a regional outage happened, it was X amount of time. We can't tell exactly how long it's going to be, but based off of trends, the last one took about 4 hours to come back online, 5 hours to come back online. Can we survive that? And that's the question you bring back to those stakeholders. And just remember, the goal is not about restoring infrastructure; it's restoring business operations. So, when we start talking about a DR solution, it's not only about what we can't live without; it's what we can't live without. It's also about what we can live without, right? So like
Yep.
I've got workloads that, perhaps do a batch job, on interval, or they're back, they have a business function, but it's not, critical to the business, right? So do I need to build that into my plan? Maybe not, right? So in a scenario like when we start talking about, especially if things are running in Azure and we know a region won't be down for, I've never seen a region be down for 24 hours. Okay, we're gonna leave that out of the plan. We're gonna write that off in the risk registrar. We're gonna get the appropriate stakeholders to understand the risk that we're assuming by doing that, and we're gonna write that off. We're not gonna have it part of our plan. That's gonna save us some money, right? Save us some
Hmm.
complexity as well, because that's the other thing. At cutover, do we want our IT staff worried about the things that are very much so critical to the business, or do we want this one little thing that we brought over that only does, a batch operation? We just don't want to deal with it at that point. We want to be focused on what we need for the business. And the last thing is, the true resiliency isn't measured by whether your backup's completed successfully. It's measured by how fast your business is running again in the event of a disaster recovery scenario. So just keep that in
Yep.
mind. You can have, once again, a great RTO and RPO on paper, but once again, if did the business get back to its full, what it's using these IT tools for, in a timely manner, and something that was agreed upon and communicated with all the various stakeholders. C-suite leadership knows that, okay, we had a regional failure. This is what we agreed upon from the IT staff, and they met what they told me that they were going to meet. And it could be that, once they get there, they realize, like, well, no, we do want to invest more money or whatever. But at the end of the day, you did your job, and that's to, provide the risk to the people that make the decisions. They make the decisions with informed data. So
Yep.
I think that's
Yeah,
about
no,
it.
exactly, Jordan. And that discussion segues into, what's the future of capacity in Azure. And one of the things a lot of folks are talking to us about right now is Fabric. Andrew brought it up earlier. You have a very minimum baseline Fabric capacity allocated. I want to throw a polling question up as we hit on Fabric a little bit, and just say, are you using Fabric? Are you currently using it for analytics? Is it something that you've looked at? Just out of curiosity, we just want to figure out, who's this relevant to? Because we see a lot of our clients starting to pivot away from traditional Power BI workloads and moving into Fabric as an analytics platform. And that's something to talk about. Just real quickly, what is Fabric? It is the holistic kind of amalgamation of everything analytics in Azure. So it factors in your data factory, it factors in your analytics platform, all of your databases, your intelligence, your IQ, which is sort of the new AI-driven insights that Microsoft is driving, and then everything Power BI does. And then it integrates it with Copilot for AI, OneLake for data warehousing, and then all of the governance that you've built out across your Azure platform. And that's one of those things that one of the more discussed things we have when it comes to Fabric and AI is, how do we build the guardrails around it? How do we keep our data from being used to train someone else's LLM? And Fabric as a unified platform builds in those controls. That being said, AI really is changing these conversations. We've hit on it a couple times. A lot of these capacity issues, the reasons behind the quota requests and all this stuff, is because AI is such a buzzword, a hot topic. And it is a driver for Microsoft's current expansion in Azure. It's the reason that we're seeing new data centers being built. It's the reason they're spending $3+ billion on each one. But it's also the reason that I can't go buy a new GPU for my home computer for less than $2,000, which, as an avid gamer, just annoys me to no end. But here we are. We're all at home still using technology from 4 or 5 years ago, because all the new stuff is going to the Microsofts, the Amazons, and the Googles, and the OpenAIs, and the Anthropics. They're the ones that are actually chewing up all of this. And it's not just affecting us at home, it's affecting us in the public cloud as well, because those workloads, that capacity that we would normally need, is basically being spoken for as soon as it's available. And that's why, it's really important that we start planning for fabric capacity before it becomes an issue. Because really why it matters is there's so many different kind of tentacles of what fabric is touching. It's not just the data, but it's the compute, it's the warehouse behind it. It is all of these features that, and we'll take a look at the next slide. It kind of shows you what exactly fabric is touching. So when you get fabric capacity, it's not just about the data, it's everything else that backs it. And it all utilizes the same capacity and consumption. So there's a lot of things that we can do via Fabric that we needed multiple different things to do previously. A lot of clients, like Andrew was talking about, are moving away from Power BI as their platform and starting to utilize Fabric. And it's important that as you start that process, engage an expert. Talk to TrustedTech, talk to your account manager, and figure out what is the best step forward so that you don't kind of get caught behind the 8 ball when it becomes time to actually start putting this stuff into production. So that said, let's talk about what tomorrow looks like. And really what we want to talk about is where we go from where we're at today. We're replatforming, we're modernizing, we're taking things a step beyond infrastructure and moving into the platforms. But that said, we need to make sure that we're cognizant of where our availability lives. So we want to make sure that our quotas are in place for stuff like Fabric, that if we're going to be leaning towards kind of homebrewed AI or machine learning, that we have that capacity planned, that we have our guardrails in place for our AI, especially if we're kind of connecting into stuff like OpenAI or Anthropic or whatever models that we're using out there, that we have policy and planning in place for growth, the guardrails for growth via stuff like Azure policy, make sure that we're planning for our analytics, and then figure out what does the next 6 to 12 months look like. Are we going to be doing M&As? Are we bringing in 1,000 new users that are going to need this additional capacity? Let's plan for it now. There's no cost for a quota increase. And working with a CSP can make sure that we assess where you're at and determine kind of where you need to go in the future. So speaking to the future, let's talk about what your 2026 and 2027 and beyond strategy looks like. And I'm going to ask Andrew to kind of comment on this before we wrap things up in just a little bit here.
Yeah, no, thank you, Lance. And I'll keep it brief as well because I want to make sure we open this up for questions too. But I mean, the big takeaway when it comes to planning specifically, right, is first things first, the best time to identify a constraint is before that migration, before the expansion from an M&A perspective, before you modernize, right? And modernize is kind of a buzzword as well. What does that actually mean, right? Modernization is simply going to expose the barriers when it comes to quota capacities today that you have, right? It's not necessarily going to create them, right? So the big three things that I would say, take a look at later this week after this call, infrastructure readiness, resiliency readiness, data and AI readiness, right? Those are the three big things. Can my environment even scale to support the future demand today that I know I'm going to have 24 months from now? That's first things first. Do I have a DR strategy in place? Is it even feasible from a cost perspective? And if everything's already set up, are those quota capacities in other regions established, right? We'd hate for you to be in a scenario where you've done the work, your team has, have crossed their T's, dotted their I's, only for quota not to be increased in a separate failover state. And then, of course, is your environment prepared for the additional availability that you have in the features with Fabric and AI and Azure OpenAI and all of these things, right? Because make no mistake, your quota capacity is probably capped there until you request it, right? So that's the big thing. Moving into governance specifically, right? And this is something, teaser here, guys. Our next webinar for next month is Shadow AI in the workplace and how governance kind of really integrates all of that, right? The three big things is plan for capacity, plan for your resiliency, and then make sure that once you have this stuff set up, that the policies that are going to improve your visibility as an IT admin, as a VP of IT, make sure you have those so you can optimize the resources, right? So you can control your costs. The last thing we want is for you guys to increase your quota capacities only for your Azure costs to skyrocket. And that's where TrustedTech can come in and help you from a cost optimization perspective too, right? Make sure you're aware of all of those things as well. Have a cool little diagram here on the next slide. kind of gives you an overview of where you should start and how we can expand outwards, right? Assessing is number one, all the way up to modernizing the Azure infrastructure with confidence and from a preparation perspective. The next slide here, which is the last one before we really start diving into the Q&A here, we're going to send this. This is going to be available to you guys after the call as well. If you want to, print it out, go through your Azure environment, or go through it with the team and do a quick little checklist. Right? Here's a readiness scorecard that Lance and the team built out, just to figure out if you guys are truly ready from a capacity and planning perspective. You should be able to confidently answer yes to these questions. If you can't, that's totally fine, right? Most people can't. It's worth having a discussion with us. It's worth having a discussion with your team. It's worth, in the back of your head, starting to look at these and say, okay, where can I maybe improve if I cannot answer yes to this? So we'll make sure you get this scorecard ready for you guys and the rest of the team. And if you can't answer yes to all of these questions, Lance, I mean, I'll pass it back over to you from an assessment perspective, right?
Those are very simple questions, but they oftentimes have extremely complicated answers, and sometimes it's difficult for clients to get a grasp on what does yes actually mean. And so what we created as an Azure team is our capacity and regional resiliency assessment, or just capacity assessment. We've built this out to take a detailed, holistic look at what you're doing in Azure, identify the risks, figure out where the areas are that are probably going to be affected by capacity moving forward, look at where your quotas are at, figure out what your workloads are now and which ones you want to kind of really pay attention to or potentially put some additional features in place. And then look at your DR and your BC posture. Figure out what you're doing now, what you're doing right, and then determine kind of where those areas of opportunity are. Typically, this is a paid assessment. What we're doing as a part of our webinar today is if you guys go through and do our regional capacity assessment as a result of today's webinar, because you attended today, we're going to credit that thing back towards any future work that you do. So it's $2,500 assessment. You get $2,500 towards any future project work that you sign within the next 30 days of TrustedTech. So the whole thing basically comes out to be free, everybody's favorite four-letter word, and it gives you the peace of mind, regardless of if you do follow-up work or not, to know that you're in a place that you are protected and insulated. So go ahead and click on the screen if you want to get signed up for that. If not, you can always just click and talk to one of our experts. If you're a CSS client, you've probably got pro service credits that you can use towards this assessment. Or you could use one of your consulting sessions just to have a chat about where you're at and how TrustedTech might be able to help. Also, click on the link to register for that Shadow AI webinar coming up next month. That's going to be a fun one. That absolutely affects every single person in this call, whether they know it or not. So make sure that you are checking that out. That's all the content we had. I want to get to our Q&A real quick. We've got a couple questions in here. One from John. Are you finding clients wanting to migrate to different regions in order to save costs? Yes. Little known fact about Azure, every region has a different price, depending on what the cost of power consumption is, the build out cost that's trying to be recouped, local government fees, all this stuff. One of the things that we do with clients, especially as part of our Trusted Advisor kind of Azure managed service, is we continually assess client costs. And for workloads that aren't latency dependent, moving those from one region to another might actually save some money. And it could also kind of kill two birds with one stone by moving the workload to a region that doesn't have as much of a capacity constraint as something like East US 2 or West Europe or something like that. So absolutely, we see that happening. And it is one of the tactics that we put in place in order to go through and actually figure out where these risks lie and how to mitigate them. And then Michael had a question about how do you view quotas and limits. If you go into your Azure subscriptions, there's actually quotas right in there. You can go into the Azure portal, just type quotas into the search bar up top. That'll pull it up. You can also, if TrustedTech is your CSP, open a ticket with us. We can absolutely provide that information to you via our ticketing system. So if you just want to know what you've got in place now, or where you might have an issue, we can kind of give you a quick rundown. But going through and running like our assessment that we were just talking about is going to give you the detailed information, and we're going to do metric look backs on your workloads too. So we're going to see where you've been consuming for the past 30 plus days and figure out where you might run into an issue as your growth needs come up there. So you can absolutely pull that up easily yourself or engage with our team, and we can help you sort that out as well.
Yeah.
So with that
And
said, I throw it over to Jordan and Andrew. Do you guys have anything else to add before we wrap up today?
real quick, I mean, just to add to Michael's point as well, greater transparency into current quotas, that's definitely information that's available via Azure. But to your point, Michael, it's kind of difficult to see that information or plan for it until you unexpectedly hit that limit, right?
Mhm.
Come and chat with us, right? There are
Yep.
services available to you in which on a bi-weekly, on a monthly cadence, people like Jordan, some of the cloud architects on Lance's team are going to be able to meet with you and say, hey, you're running pretty high in consumption for this specific VM, or, hey, based off of the conversation we had 2 or 3 months ago, it's probably worth taking a look at a quota capacity and increase for this specific resource. But
Yep.
either way, we're more than happy to help you out and coordinate where you can see that stuff within Azure yourself too.
The before we wrap up, the one takeaway I want to throw out there to everybody is be proactive about these things. As soon as you become reactive to capacity, that's when you run into problems and you start having to open tickets with Microsoft and you're delaying deployments and rollouts and expansion and all that stuff. We can help you be proactive. We can help you get out ahead of this stuff. So I hope if there's one thing that you take away from our chat today, it's that being proactive with capacity is really that's the true one way to mitigate risk moving forward. So that's all we had for the gang today. I hope you guys had a good time. Be sure to tune in next month while we talk about Shadow AI, and do please register for that webinar ahead of time. And that being said, my name's Lance. It's been a pleasure being with you. Thank you, Jordan and Andrew, for joining us today. And as always, thanks, Ashley, for running the show behind the scenes. We love you, and you do a great job with this. So thanks a ton, everybody. Have a great rest of your day. We'll see you next time.
Thanks,
Take care,
everyone.
everybody.
Thank you, Lance. Goodbye.